Before we get into the video, could everyone please subscribe to my channel? Thank you so much. She was a young Cherokee widow dying in the hills until a wealthy rancher found her and called her beautiful. The wind screamed like a dying thing through the pines, bending limbs and rattling what was left of the rotted window frame. Snow blew sideways, clinging to everything, seeping in through cracks and broken boards. Inside the one-room shack, a fireless hearth stared black and cold. The walls creaked under the weight of the storm, and each gust threatened to carry the place into the canyon below. Ioka lay on the dirt floor, wrapped in a torn quilt that barely reached her feet. Her lips were cracked, her breath shallow. The fever had taken root days ago, and hunger had finished the rest. She had not eaten since the last handful of acorn flour, and even that had turned her stomach. Her fingers were curled into fists beneath her, though not from strength, only habit. Her long black hair stuck to her damp brow, her skin waxy under the dim gray light. Outside, the wind shifted. Hoofbeats. She blinked, disoriented, unsure if it was real or just another hallucination. Then she heard it again, steady and deliberate, the sound of something living in this place that had forgotten life. She tried to lift her head but only managed to turn slightly toward the door. Her voice was a rasp. "If you have come to kill me," she whispered, "please do it quickly." There was a pause. Then the creak of a saddle, the thud of boots hitting snow. Footsteps. A shadow filled the open doorway, framed by snow and dusk. A man stood there, tall and broad-shouldered, his hat heavy with frost. A rifle was slung across his back, his coat dusted white. His face was rough around the edges, sun-lined and storm-worn, but his eyes were sharp and alert. Thomas Whitaker. He had not meant to stop. He had not meant to find anyone. He had been out looking for a few wayward cattle that had broken the fence near the northern ridge. When the storm rolled in, he veered off the trail, hoping to find shelter. The cabin had looked empty from the tree-lean, abandoned. But the voice that whispered, half prayer, half dare, had stopped him cold. Now, inside the doorway, he stared down at the woman barely breathing on the floor. Her face was drawn but striking, high cheekbones and a proud brow, even in its weariness. She looked young, Cherokee, he thought immediately, maybe 22, 23 at most, dying, that part was unmistakable. "You alone?" he asked, voice low. She coughed once, sharp and wet. "Is there another you do not see?" He stepped inside, shutting the door behind him to blunt the wind. His boots thudded against the floor as he knelt beside her. Her skin was burning under his fingers. He touched her forehead, then looked around. No food, no firewood, no light but the gray of dying day. "You will not make it through the night," he said, more to himself than to her. She gave a faint, bitter laugh. "Then do not waste time. Go. Leave me." He looked down at her, then at the broken room. "No," she blinked. What he stood moved to the hearth and started. Stacking what little would remain, a flint from his coat pocket sparked a fire coaxed carefully from the cold ashes. When the flame caught, he stepped back to her side, lifting her gently in his arms. "What are you doing?" she murmured. "Keeping you alive," she groaned as he carried her toward the fire, setting her down on the only intact blanket near the warmth. "Why?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Because someone should." She turned her face away. "You do not know who I am." "I know what you are," he said. "A human being freezing to death." She stared into the fire, silent. Outside, the wind still howled. But inside the cabin, for the first time in days, something fought back against the cold. Thomas sat beside her, pulling a canteen from his saddlebag. He dribbled water into her mouth slowly, watching her chest rise and fall, each breath steadier than the last. He knew what would come next, the questions, the stares, the judgment if anyone found out. A white man sheltering a Cherokee woman was an invitation for trouble in these parts. Folks were cruel even when sober, and the storm wouldn't keep them quiet for long. But as he watched her curl tighter into the warmth, a whisper of color returning to her cheeks, he knew one thing with absolute certainty: he had made his choice, and he would not turn away from it. The road to Thomas's ranch was long, winding through pines and past frozen creeks. But Ioka remembered little of it. She drifted in and out of sleep, her head lolling against his chest as he held her steady on the saddle. When they arrived, the sky had just begun to lighten, casting the land in a bluish haze. His ranch house stood simple and sturdy against the cold, a place built not for beauty but for survival. Inside, Thomas lit a fire and laid her on a cot near the hearth. He boiled water, cleaned her wounds, and wrapped her in the thickest quilt he had. He worked quietly, carefully, saying nothing unless necessary. He had no gentle hands, but they were steady, experienced. He treated her like someone who mattered, not someone to pity. When she woke later, her first instinct was to reach for the knife she no longer had. Her eyes scanned the unfamiliar room, then landed on Thomas, seated by the window polishing a rifle. "You brought me here," she rasped. He nodded once. "Storm would have killed you. I did not ask for saving." "No," he said, not looking at her. "You did not." She sat up slowly, every movement a protest from her bruised body. Her throat felt dry, raw. He handed her a cup of warm water. She took it with hesitation, then drank. When she handed it back, she met his eyes. "I do not need your pity." "You do not have it," he replied simply. That startled her. Most white men she had encountered either treated her like a thing to fear or a cause to weep over. This one seemed to do neither. Over the next 2 days, they spoke little. She ate what he gave her, rested when he told her to, but her eyes never stopped watching him. Suspicion lingered. On ran deep, and for good reason. She had seen what kindness often turned into. Yet Thomas never crossed the line. He never cried, never touched her without cause. On the third morning, she asked, "Why do you live alone?" He glanced up from the kettle. "Lost my wife and son 5 winters ago. Fire in the barn. Got there too late." She said, nothing at first, then quieter, "I lost my husband last spring. Shot while trying to stop your men from burning our food stores." He paused. "They were not my men." She tilted her head. "They all wear the same boots." He nodded slowly. "And yet I pulled you from the snow." She looked away, but something inside her softened a fraction. Later that evening, he sat by the fire and peeled apples with a small hunting knife. She watched him from the cot. "You said, you do not pity me," she said. "I do not." "Then why?" He set down the knife. "Because I know what it feels like to lose everything and be told you deserve it." That silenced her. Outside, the wind moved through the trees like a hymn. Inside, 2 people sat in the quiet flicker of firelight. Not yet friends, not yet anything, but no longer strangers. And for the first time in weeks, Aoka did not feel entirely alone. It started with whispers. A clerk at the general store noticed the extra supplies Thomas purchased. More flour than usual, another spool of thread, 2 pairs of gloves instead of 1. Then a neighbor spotted Ioka in the distance, gathering kindling at the edge of the woods. Her dark braid, her deer hide boots, the unmistakable profile of someone who did not belong. The storm had passed, but another kind of cold was setting in. By the end of the week, the whispers had become talk. Talk became judgment, and judgment in the town of Red Hollow was always looking for a reason to burn. Thomas was hauling feed bags off his wagon when the first confrontation came. "Word is you got a squaw holed up in your house," said Jed Harrow, a rancher from 3 miles west, arms crossed and jaw set. Thomas didn't look up. "Word travels fast, faster than it ought to," Jed muttered. "You know what people say, don't you?" "I know most people don't have a damn thing better to do." Jed stepped closer. "Come on, Whitaker. What's a man like you doing harboring the likes of her?" Thomas dropped the last sack of oats with a thud. He turned, wiping his hands on a rag. The likes of her? You mean a human being who was freezing to death in the hills? She's Cherokee, Jed said flatly. Their kind killed my uncle near Fort Gibson. And mine died in the war, Thomas replied. But I don't go blaming every man in uniform for it. A second voice joined in. Joe Lawson, the blacksmith, eyes narrowed. It ain't just who she is, it's what she represents. Folks think you've gone soft. That you're siding with enemies. Thomas stared at them both for a long moment. Then he walked past them and unhitched his horse. She's not your business, he said, and she's not going anywhere. They called after him, but he didn't. Back at the ranch, Ioka stood on the porch, arms folded tight. She had seen him ride in, seen the way the men leaned toward him like they wanted to fight. She could read their faces even from 100 yards. When Thomas stepped inside, she was waiting. I should not be here, she said without preamble. He closed the door behind him, the wind pressing against the wood like a warning. You are exactly where you need to be. I'm causing trouble. You are not. They will hurt you, she said softly. They will take your land, your name. For what? For saving me. He walked past her, lit the fire, and took his time before answering. I've lived half my life with more ghosts than friends. The rest of it waiting for someone to blame me for what I could not change. Let them come. She stepped closer, her voice near a whisper. Why? Why risk everything? He looked up at her, and in his eyes was something immovable. Because some things are worth more than land or pride or peace. And you? His voice lowered, you deserve to be safe. She stared at him, words caught in her throat. Outside, the wind howled again, sharp and cold. Inside, a man had drawn his line. And for the first time, Ioka realized he meant it. Truly, fiercely. He would fight for her even if it meant standing alone. Spring began to whisper across the hills before winter had fully surrendered. The snow melted slow, cautious and stubborn, leaving behind patches of soft mud and the first green blades of grass daring enough to reach for the sun. Trees stood bare still, but the buds had begun to swell at their fingertips, ready to bloom in defiance of frost. Birds returned in hesitant pairs, and the creek behind the barn sang again, its voice clear and cold and alive. At the Whitaker Ranch, life took on a rhythm as gentle as the thawing land. Thomas chopped wood at dawn, his breath ghosting in the air. Ioka fed the hands, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, and patched worn shirts near the fire with quiet focus. They moved around each other with ease. Now, two people bound not by words but by something steadier, something that grew without effort. She no longer flinched when he entered a room. He no longer measured his voice before he spoke. Sometimes they talked, not much, just fragments about the weather, the stubbornness of the soil, or which hens were the loudest. Once, over morning coffee, he asked, "What does your name mean?" She brought happiness, Ioka answered, eyes far away as if the meaning belonged to someone else. But not everyone liked what she brought. He had smiled faintly at that. Most folks don't know what to do with happiness when they find it. They left it there, the words lingering like wood smoke. One afternoon, the sky turned the kind of gold that only happens in early spring when the sun is low. The wind still bites, but warmth lies just beneath the surface. Ioka knelt in the garden bed, pressing the last of the onion bulbs into the soft earth. Her braid had come loose, strands. A streak of dirt ran down her forearm, and her sleeves were rolled up to her elbows. Her hands, though blistered from work, moved with gentle purpose, as if the earth trusted her. Thomas watched her from the porch, arms folded across his chest. He hadn't meant to stare, but something about the way she moved, quiet, deliberate, as if the soil itself spoke to her, held him still. When she stood and brushed her palms clean on her skirt, he spoke. "You're beautiful." She froze. For a moment, she thought she had imagined it, that the wind had twisted his words into something she wished to hear. But when she turned, he was still looking at her, his face unreadable but not uncertain. Ioka blinked. No one has ever said that to me. Then they've been blind, he said, his voice low. Or fools. Her heart thudded once, hard, like it was waking from something deep. She looked away, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. Her fingers trembled just slightly. You don't have to say things like that, she murmured. Especially not to me. I don't say anything I don't mean, he replied, his tone even. Neither of us is supposed to feel anything again. But here we are. They stood there in the soft breeze, a few paces apart. The silence between them stretched, not heavy, not awkward, just fragile, like something waiting to be named. I used to be someone's wife, she said, her voice barely more than a breath. I knew what it felt like to be wanted, to be held like I mattered. I didn't think I'd ever feel that again. Not from a white man. He stepped down from the porch but stopped short of reaching her. I don't see you as Cherokee first, he said. I see you as Ioka. And when I look at you, I see someone who stayed kind in a world that tried to crush her. Her eyes shimmered, not tears, not yet, but the slow warmth of something thawing inside her. She didn't step closer. Neither did he. But something between them shifted, like a door opening quietly in the dark. They weren't lovers, not yet. But the space between them no longer felt empty. It felt like waiting, like promise. The knock on the door came just after sunset. It was not the gentle tap of a neighbor or a friend. It was a hard, deliberate pound, a fist against wood, echoing like a warning through the house. Thomas opened the door with his rifle slung across his shoulder. 3 men stood on the porch, their coats dusty, faces drawn tight. The leader, a stocky man with a gray beard and hard eyes, stepped forward. Evening, Whitaker, Marshal Thomas greeted flatly. Didn't expect a visit. We heard you've got company, the marshal said, voice calm but sharp. A Cherokee woman staying under your roof. Thomas said nothing. Another man behind the marshal spit into the dirt. We're not here to debate. We're here to collect. Thomas's hand tightened on the door frame. Collect what? You know what she is, the marshal said. Word around town is she's tied to a raiding party last spring. Some folks lost cattle. One man lost his wife. That's a lie. Maybe the marshal allowed it, maybe not. But you keeping her here, that's a risk we're not willing to let stand. Thomas stepped outside, closing the door behind him. She's not your concern. She's every settler's concern, the younger deputy snapped. This ain't about hate. It's about keeping our people safe. She hasn't hurt anyone, Thomas said evenly. She's not leaving. The marshal's voice cooled. Then you leave us no choice. If she's here tomorrow, we'll come back with more men and fewer manners. They turned and walked off into the dark, their horses crunching frost beneath heavy hooves. Inside, Ioka had heard everything. She stood in the center of the room, hands clenched at her sides. You should have let them in, she said quietly. Thomas locked the door and turned to her. No, they'll kill you. I'm not afraid of them. You should be. He walked to her slowly, placing his hands on her shoulders. You are not a burden. You are not danger. You're someone worth standing for. She shook her head, tears brimming. I won't let you burn for me. Thomas's voice lowered. I won't let them take you. But that night, long after he had fallen asleep in the chair by the hearth, Ioka rose. She moved quietly, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders and tying her worn boots tight. She took nothing but a canteen and the small knife Thomas had given her for planting. No food, no goodbye. She stood over him for a long moment, watching the firelight flicker over his face. He looked younger in sleep, gentler, a man who had chosen her not once but every day since. "I love you," she whispered, though he would never hear it. Then she slipped out into the cold. The wind had teeth. The moon hung low. She walked south toward the woods, the trail winding behind her like a ribbon of sorrow. She did not cry. She had made her choice. Love sometimes meant leaving. And if Thomas Whitaker died defending her, she would never forgive herself. So she vanished into the night, a shadow born of grief and grace. And behind her, the fire kept burning. Thomas woke to silence. The fire had burned low. Only faint orange embers pulsed beneath the ashes like a heartbeat slowing in sleep. The house was still, too still. The only sound was the faint creak of the chair beneath him as he stirred. He rubbed the sleep from his eyes and reached for the pot of coffee beside the hearth. Cold. Then his eyes drifted toward the corner. The cot was empty, the blanket folded with care, the shawl missing from its hook. A terrible stillness settled in his chest. "Ioka," he said aloud, though part of him already knew the answer. She was gone. Thomas was out the door before he realized he had not put on his boots properly. The icy ground bit through the soles of his socks, but he didn't care. He ran out onto the porch, scanning the trail that cut between the trees, already half erased by the light fall of snow from the night before. No prints, no note. There was no sign of struggle, just absence. He saddled his horse with shaking hands, cursing under his breath. Within minutes, he was riding hard past the creek where she liked to walk, past the grove of cedars she once said reminded her of home. His voice cracked as he shouted her name into the wind. "Ioka." Only crows answered, startled into flight. By midday, he had circled the valley twice. His voice was gone, his throat raw. He stopped once to water the horse, but even then, his eyes never stopped scanning the horizon. By sundown, he had reached the edge of Red Bluff Ridge, miles from the ranch. His lips were split and bleeding, his knuckles scraped from pulling low branches out of his way. His coat was damp from sweat and snow melt, and still he pushed forward. He finally stopped when the trail turned rocky and the signs grew faint. He dismounted, heart hammering, and crouched low to the earth. Then he saw it, a thread of dark wool snagged on a bramble bush. He recognized the weave he'd sewn that fringe with his own hands last winter, clumsy but proud. He clutched it in his palm. "You foolish, brave, impossible woman," he muttered. "What are you doing out here alone?" 2 more days passed. He asked trappers at campsites, crossed through hollowed ravines settlers avoided, and followed deer trails until his horse nearly gave out beneath him. When he passed through small outposts, the settlers eyed him wearily. "You're looking for her," they'd ask, voice low. "Let her go, Whitaker. You'll lose everything." He didn't answer them because he had already lost everything once, and he would not do it again. On the 3rd day, at the edge of a wooded ravine, he saw smoke, thin white curling through the trees like a signal. Hope flared in his chest, and he moved carefully, hand on his rifle, but praying he wouldn't need it. He dismounted and walked on foot, boots silent over moss and pine needles until he saw them, a small Cherokee camp nestled between trees, quiet and unthreatening. A boy by the fire saw him first, then darted inside a tent. A moment later, a woman stepped out, tall and commanding, her hair streaked with gray, and behind her, Ioka. She stood stiff in a wool cloak too big for her frame. Her eyes widened when she saw him. Thomas froze. The world fell still. She stepped forward, her breath catching. "Thomas," he said, closing the distance in 3 long strides. "You left," he said, voice trembling. "I woke up and you were gone." "I had to," she said, trembling. "They would have come back." He took her hands in his calloused palms against hers. "I do not care what they would have done. I care that you are here, that you are safe." "But I am not," her eyes searched his face. "Why?" "Because I cannot breathe without you." Tears welled in her eyes. "I thought I was protecting you," she whispered. "You were destroying me," he said softly. Behind her, the elder woman nodded once, then stepped away, granting them space. Thomas reached up and brushed a strand of hair from Ioka's cheek. "Come home with me," he whispered. "Let me build something that belongs to neither of our pasts." "I do not belong anywhere," she said, barely audible. He leaned closer, his voice a vow, "You belong with me." For a moment, the world held its breath. Then she stepped into his arms and rested her forehead against his chest. His arms wrapped around her tight, unyielding, as if to anchor her to the earth. "I thought you'd hate me for leaving," she said. "I hated the world without you in it." That night, beneath a blanket of pine trees and stars, they lay beside each other. No promises, no plans, just two hearts learning how to beat in the same rhythm again. And for the first time in a long time, neither of them dreamed of sorrow. They returned just before sunrise. The ranch stood as they had left it, silent, weathered, stubborn against the wind. The wooden fence leaned with age. The barn door sagged on its hinge, and the porch steps creaked as Thomas stepped up and looked out over his land. Smoke still clung faintly to the chimney, a ghost of warmth left behind. The hens clucked lazily in the coop, scratching at frostbitten straw, oblivious to the storm that gathered far beyond the hills. Thomas helped Ioka down from the saddle. Her legs were stiff from the ride, but she moved with quiet steadiness. She stood at the edge of the porch for a long moment, looking at the house, at the scars in the wood, the cracked shutters, the place where the roof still needed mending. It had once been a place of solitude, a shell. Now it held the weight of something more. She glanced at him, uncertain. "It is," he said, reading her thoughts. "If you want it." She nodded slowly, but her gaze drifted toward the horizon. There was no mistaking the tension in her jaw. "They'll come, I know," he said. He did not need to ask who. The same men who had come before, righteous in their anger, convinced in their cause. Word would have spread that she was gone and returned. The same boots that had scuffed up his porch would return, heavier with more dust and sharper reasons. But this time, they would not be unprepared. They spent the day moving with quiet urgency. Thomas boarded up the windows and checked each rifle, laid extra rounds along the mantel, and reinforced the latch on the back door. Ioka swept the cellar clean, laid blankets, filled jugs of water, and tucked a hunting knife into the folds of her skirt. It was not fear that moved them, it was resolve. By nightfall, the sky had turned iron gray, not with rain, but with a stillness that warned of what was to come. They came at dusk. 5 riders, just as before. Same men, same threats. But this time, Thomas did not meet them on the porch. He stood in the yard, boots planted in frozen earth, rifle in hand, coat flapping in the rising wind. Ioka stood beside him, shoulders back, her braid tight and long down her back, whipping in the wind like a banner. She had not hidden. She had not flinched. The marshal pulled up his horse, eyes narrowed beneath a brim heavy with dust. "You've had your warn. Ing Whitaker," he said, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Now hand her over or we'll take her." "No," Thomas said. The word fell like a hammer. The deputy snarled, "She's not one of us. She's a danger. She's not yours to judge." Thomas replied, eyes steady, "Then you're siding against your own." Thomas's voice hardened like steel. "I'm siding with what's right." There was a beat of silence. The horses shifted restlessly. Men glanced at each other, hands brushing the grips of their pistols. Then Ioka stepped forward, her voice clear. "I am not afraid of you," she said. "But I will not run anymore." The marshal's jaw clenched. "Then you'll both die here." "No," Thomas said again, softer now but more dangerous than ever. "We'll live here together, and anyone who wants to change that will have to go through me." They saw it then, not just a man and a woman, but something larger, something built on defiance and devotion, something neither their laws nor their fear could break. They hesitated. One rider turned his horse. Another spat into the dirt and followed. Soon, only dust remained. Ioka looked up at Thomas, her voice just a breath. "We did not beg for peace." "No," he said, watching the last of the riders disappear. "We made it." And as the sun dipped behind the ridge, painting the world in gold and rust, they stood side by side, unyielding, unafraid. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Spring came early that year. The valley bloomed as if the land itself had chosen to forget the harshness of winter. Wildflowers stretched along the creek bed, and the soil grew rich with promise. At the Whitaker Ranch, seeds took root, and not just in the fields. The townspeople did not change overnight, but change came quietly, like rain soaking into dry ground. An old widow began leaving eggs by their gate. A young couple offered to trade wool for flour. No one spoke apologies, but the silence shifted. Suspicion faded into acceptance. And when the marshal came through again months later, he simply tipped his hat and rode on. Thomas and Ioka rebuilt what had been damaged. The barn was repaired with cedar beams, the porch with a new swing overlooking the hills. They worked side by side, her laughter echoing across the fields, his quiet strength anchoring every day. They never spoke much of the night she ran or the man who threatened to tear them apart. It lived in their bones now, part of them but not all of them. What mattered more was the present, the future. On a warm June afternoon, they stood beneath the same cottonwood where she had first planted spring onions. There was no preacher, no choir, just a circle of neighbors, a woven sash from her people, and an old gold ring Thomas had kept in a drawer for too long. Ioka wore a white cotton dress embroidered with red thread, symbols passed down from her grandmother. Thomas wore a jacket once belonging to his father, cleaned and mended. They exchanged no grand vows, only hands, only eyes, only truth. A neighbor's daughter played a fiddle off-key, and when Thomas kissed Ioka for the first time as his wife, the breeze carried petals through the air like snow. Later that night, they sat on the porch side by side, watching the last of the fireflies dance. "You once told me I was beautiful," she said, resting her head on his shoulder. "I still see it," she smiled. "Not everyone would." "I am not everyone." The stars blinked above them. No gunfire, no threats, just quiet. "You think they've accepted us?" she asked. He took her hand. "They don't need to. We accepted each other." She looked out across the land, green, stubborn, and free. And in her heart, she knew this love did not need permission. It had already proven itself, not by words but by weathering every storm. Thank you for riding with us through this unforgettable tale of courage, healing, and love that crossed every line drawn by fear. She was a young Cherokee widow dying in the hills until a wealthy rancher found her and called her beautiful. This is not just a story of survival, it's a reminder that sometimes love is the most rebellious thing a heart can choose. If this story moved you, lingering in your chest like the last light on the prairie, then make sure to subscribe to Wild West Love Stories. Here, every week, we bring you tales of forbidden romance, untamed hearts, and the kind of devotion that doesn't ask permission. Love isn't always easy out here, but it's always worth fighting for. Hit that bell, subscribe, and saddle up because the frontier has more stories to tell. We'll see you on the next ride.